You ready, Paul?
Yep.
Alrighty. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Richard Brethour-Bell. I'm the Vice President of Accessibility, Diversity, and Inclusion for InterPride. I have with me today Paul Huddleston-White. Paul, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little about your experience with InterPride, and remember your pronouns, because I didn't. Mine are he, him, his pronouns.
Well, my name is Paul Huddleston-White. My pronouns are he, him. I am the former president of Austin Pride from 2012 until 2018. Oh, sorry, 2018. And that time I was also the Region 3 director for InterPride alongside Richard, and served as a co-chair for World Pride 2019.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to have you here, Paul. We wanted to talk today a little bit about implicit bias awareness. This is something I want to break up into two parts because normally when I get this workshop, it feels a little rushed, and I don't want to do that this time. And I really want to focus on microaggressions. And one of the reasons this came to mind was that I used to work at a hospital in human resources, and we were going to have a meeting with staff to talk about diversity and inclusion programs. And I had one of the topics of microaggression. And one of the nurses said, well, what is microaggression? And I gave her an example. I said, listen, I have dreadlocks, and people would come up to me and ask me if I wash my dreadlocks. So that's these little, indignities that you suffer, because that's not a question that we normally ask anybody. And right as I said that, the CEO of the hospital came in and said, well, he used to live in Florida, and he knew Haitians, and he knew that they didn't wash their hair. And I thought, really? So I said, well, I also lived in Florida, and I knew Haitians, and I had no reason to believe that anyone didn't wash their hair. So I don't understand where this comes from. 2 weeks later, I was fired. So I don't know if that had anything to do with that or not. But let me ask you, Paul, about your understanding of microaggression.
My understanding of microaggressions is kind of what it's touched on. It's where you have someone who, whether they're ignorant that they're doing it or they're doing it, are going up to a person of color, regardless of what nationality they are, and picking on those little things, those little tendencies toward bias. So they might ask an Asian person if they can add something correctly, or they might ask a person with dreadlocks, do they wash their hair? Or they may ask a Native American person, can I? Those are the type of things. Those are microaggressions that
Absolutely.
Even if they don't know that they're doing it, they're still doing it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's the point that people really need to understand. Even if you don't, in your mind, you're not intentionally trying to insult someone, it doesn't change the possibility that that's what
the fact that you did that. Exactly.
Yeah. All righty, let's go ahead and get started with this. So we'll talk about what is implicit bias, and we'll focus on microaggressions. There's this incredible book that I feel like it's really changed my life, Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. So we'll discuss a little bit of that book and some of her quotes from the book, and then some famous quotes, and then we'll do a little Q&A and see if anyone have any questions. But since this is recorded, I guess the only question is going to come from either InterPride or you, Paul. But we'll go ahead and get started. So as we talked about implicit bias or conscious bias, this was a term that was first coined back in 1995 by psychologists Banaji and Greenwald. And specifically, implicit bias refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious way, making them difficult to control. So it's kind of like what you were saying, Paul, even if you're not aware that what you're doing is offensive, doesn't change the outcome. So we're going to watch a little bit, watch a video. It's a short video. And what this does is really kind of put the whole thing into context, see it in action. And this would be a great opportunity for some kind of self-awareness, you know, to see if we are, and chances are we are, you know, we all have bias. We all engage in implicit bias, but this is to help us to be a little bit more aware of that. So Ryan, would you play that video, please?
Implicit bias exists when we unconsciously hold attitudes towards others or associate stereotypes with them. For example, we often harbor negative stereotypes about others without consciously realizing that we do so. Implicit bias, which is also called unconscious bias or implicit social cognition, is a prejudice that is deep-seated within the brain, below the conscious level. Studies have demonstrated implicit bias against racial groups, genders, LGBTQ, and other marginalized groups. We may even be prejudiced against our own group, although we tend to favor our in-group with positive stereotypes and disfavor out-groups with negative stereotypes.
The immediate feeling you get or the immediate thoughts you have about a person, an assumption you feel, just anything you feel really stems somewhere from an experience you've had or your upbringing.
It depends on the region you're from, the country you're from, the background you grew up in. That shapes the person's unconscious bias.
I think sometimes you don't even realize it, but your own actions, maybe the way you treat others as opposed to treating others that look like you or that act like you or that are your friends.
Implicit bias often runs counter to people's conscious, expressed beliefs. Few physicians espouse racially discriminatory views, and yet doctors tend to recommend less pain medication for Black patients than for white patients with the identical injury. In other words, people can be explicitly unbiased, yet implicitly biased, according to psychologist Daniel Kelly and colleagues.
One of my closest friends since high school, we've worked on a lot of projects together, we've been in a lot of classes together. Sometimes we'd be working together in a group project, for example, and she would say stuff like, oh, you're good at math, you're good at science, here, you can take this part of the project or something. I don't hold it against her or anything, and she doesn't mean any harm by it, but obviously there's that implicit sort of bias or stereotype that Asians are better at math and science.
Implicit bias has been found in a large array of studies using various tests, but much of the evidence for the phenomenon comes from Harvard University's Project Implicit website, home of the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. Literally millions of people have visited this site and taken various tests that ask them to respond rapidly to questions that require them to associate Blacks or whites, males or females, or young or old, etc., with positive or negative words.
Most of the implicit biases that I've run into are probably positive ones, things that come with being a white male and having height and having a good voice and things like that.
Professor Nosek and colleagues tested more than 700,000 subjects and found that more than 70% of white subjects more easily associated white faces with positive words and Black faces with negative words, concluding that this was evidence of implicit racial bias. In fact, additional evidence indicates that measures of implicit bias better predict people's conduct than measures of explicit bias.
I think that if you are anyone, to be blunt, that it's not a white male, you potentially feel that implicit bias. Maybe you're just looking for someone that is like you because you like you, and so you want to be around more people like you. But what's really rooted under that is that you potentially don't think that someone else is as smart or as capable, And that is coming from a place of implicit bias.
Now here's some good news. Various scientists have criticized the IAT. They point out, for example, that individuals who take the test on different dates often score substantially differently. Even IAT supporters admit that implicit bias, at least as demonstrated by the test, is widespread but relatively minor and has only a small impact upon people's real-world actions. In other words, the results of the test are not strong enough to predict particular behaviors by individual people. However, let's not get too comfortable. Even if the IAT cannot predict the future conduct of any one individual on a given occasion, it still indicates how groups of people will act on average, and that is worrisome. For example, few people openly advocate for discrimination in hiring, but white applicants receive 50% more responses from potential employers than do black applicants with the same resume. Likewise, college professors are substantially more likely to answer student emails if the students' names indicate that they are probably white than if the names sound like they belong to black students. And in one study, online course instructors were 94% more likely to respond to discussion posts by white male students than by other students.
There are a lot of opportunities to promote people within the workplace. It doesn't happen because of different biases. People assume, a woman is of a certain age or they're married and you think, oh, she's going to want to have kids, so we're not going to give her this really tough, big project.
When I graduated from West Point in 2009, I went to my first organization, the first unit assignment. I was the only Latino officer in a group of about 100 other officers. Yeah, I think there was a lot of hesitation in really following my lead as a leader for the organization. I think it hindered in some way the ability for us to build cohesive trust within our organization and really have that going into a combat environment.
Because implicit bias operates at a mostly unconscious level, it is difficult for individuals to overcome. No existing training regime has proven particularly effective at debiasing implicit bias. But, fortunately, some research shows that stereotypes can be unlearned, and that safeguards can be put in place to minimize their impact. For example, women used to make up only a relatively small percentage of the musicians in orchestras. But when orchestras began holding blind auditions, where the applicants played behind a curtain and their genders were unknown to the judges, the percentage of women chosen to play in symphony orchestras doubled. Perhaps we can put a dent in implicit bias after all.
These biases are sometimes so deep-rooted within us or within our culture that we don't even realize that they are biases.
We could have a mutually, beneficial conversation and really benefit from learning from each other and really understand that we're all not that different.
Listen, really absorb the experiences of those around you, especially those who come from backgrounds that are unlike yours.
Learn something new about a person, and then that will kind of help shift that bias, because now you've actually asked that person, or now you get to know that person.
There's so many opportunities to engage with others, to say, I don't want to do this again. Can you help me not do that? And people are willing to have those conversations.
Kind of feels like that the more you know commercials. Remember those?
But right there at the end, two of those women gave my two favorite L words: listen and learn.
Mm-hmm.
Love that.
Absolutely. So, what were some other takeaways for you, Paul, from that video?
Honestly, and it was like I was saying before, even if someone doesn't realize that they are vocalizing this deep-seated bias that they don't even know exists within themselves, they think, oh, I'm not racist, I'm not a bigot, I'm not homophobic, and yet they'll ask a question to a gay man of, do you top or do you bottom? Okay, that's just those little microaggressions are just they can be so hurtful, and it was like I was saying earlier, whether it's, whether it's asking an Asian person to help with the math problem, whether it's the braids on the Black person, asking how they do that. How do you keep your braids? How do you keep your dreads? Do they stink? Do they smell? All those little microaggressions that someone can, another person, without even thinking about it, is almost worse to me, because it's almost like a second nature coming out directly, and they're not what they're saying within their brain. They're like, is this appropriate? Is this something that you someone? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And then when the person becomes offended by it, then, the perpetrator gets mad at them. Like, why are you offended? No, why did you say it? Did you think about what you said and how it might impact a person? But now, because I'm offended by something you said, I'm the one with the problem. And that seems to be like the prevailing attitude when we encounter bias.
Exactly. And it's almost as if, my two favorite L's, again, you point something out, that really wasn't an appropriate thing to say to me. And then the perpetrator gets offended. Well, how dare you? And that's a perfect opportunity to come back and say, you know what? You said something offensive to me. I really need you to listen to the words I'm saying. And I want you to learn that you cannot of a person A, B, or C.
Right. One of the young women mentioned that it's so much part of our culture. It's deeply rooted in our society. How can anyone think that they wouldn't be affected?
Exactly.
Like I hear people say, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I'm like, you know what? Simply because you said that, I don't believe you, because we all have some biases.
And that's the person that you get in the car later. They're like, oh, she's Asian. Because she wouldn't move or go fast enough, and it's all those little things that just some people say without even thinking, and you're like, you really don't get it. We need to learn a little more.
Right, totally agree. Let's see, we'll go on to the next slide. So we talked about bias a little bit, but so now I want to kind of focus on microaggressions. So microaggression is a term used for brief and commonplace daily verbal or behavioral indignities, whether intentional or unintentional. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Whether you meant to do it or not, it doesn't change the impact, as we pointed out. And that they communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes toward stigmatized or culturally marginalized groups, including women. And that's one of the things we talked about, just walking up to someone like, oh, is that your real hair? I mean, I can understand if you're asking a person that you have a close friendship with, but then I'm thinking if you have that close friendship or relationship, you probably already know, but to go up to strangers, I'm curious, is that your real hair? Like,
I would never.
I know.
I would never ask a drag queen that.
Oh, I know. It's utterly ridiculous. So we had some examples of microaggressions. We won't go through all of these, but I wanted to point out when we talk about a theme, the microaggression itself, and the message. For example, alien in own land when Asian Americans and Latino Americans are assumed to be foreign born. So the microaggression is, where are you from? And I've had this too. Like, where are you from? Well, from California. No,
exactly.
Where are you from originally? Where were you born? You speak good English, and the message that you are sending, whether intentional or not, is that you are not American. You are a foreigner, And then the one of my favorite ones, the colorblindness statements that indicate that a white person does not want to acknowledge race, which is what it means when people say, well, I don't see race, I'm colorblind. What you're telling me is that I don't want to acknowledge that you're different. So when I look at you, I don't see color. America's a melting pot. There's only one race, the human race. And what you're doing is denying, the message that we're getting is that you're denying a person of color, their racial and ethnic experiences. You are telling them, in order to be an American, that you need to assimilate. You're denying the individual as a racial, cultural, individual. So these are the messages, whether intentional or not, that you're sending. Well, Paul, let me ask
Exactly.
you.
Almost like they're trying to mute the expression. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Mute the expression of your ethnic background, mute the expression of your skin, mute of your hair. You know, it's all just one race. We're all one people. Well, actually not true. And actually all races and ethnicity should be celebrated.
Absolutely.
You know, there's such diversity in the world. Why on earth would we all want to be the same?
Right. You know, my grandfather used to say that there are so many variety of flowers that are so pretty. Why is it that you would only like one? And I thought, well, that's it exactly. We come in different shades, different colors. Instead of focusing on one being better than the other, why don't we appreciate the differences that that each bring, just like we do flowers? Whether we like a carnation or we like a rose, they're different. But neither is better than the other.
Exactly. And I speaking to that, alien in the homeland, I was born abroad, born in a military family. I was born in Germany, but I was also born on U.S. soil. So a lot of people don't really know, they're not familiar with the military. They don't know that military bases abroad are considered U.S. soil and you're U.S. born, even though you're born in that country. Right. So my entire life, whenever I've had to go and fill out any official document, get a passport or driver's license or what have you, and I always put my birthplace is Stuttgart, Germany. And when they go through my paperwork, you can almost see a change. They're like, oh, you were born in Germany? Like, oh, I had already mentally accepted you as an American because your skin is white. And now I have to reorder what I was thinking. And then I really throw them for a loop when I tell them, well, yeah, I was born in Germany, but I was born on U.S. soil. And it just blows their mind.
Like, what do you mean? How's that possible?
What do you mean? How does that work? And I've had those questions. How does that work? That right? So yeah, it exists even for someone with complexion. You tell them something that they're not expecting, and they have almost the same reaction. It's just in reverse in their brain, and you can see it working out on their face when it happens.
They're thinking out loud.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the whole thing about this implicit bias and unconscious bias is that we all have it. We're all affected by these negative messages in society, whether we are intentionally perpetrating that or not. It's there as part of what makes up our society, unfortunately. How is it that you wouldn't be affected by it one way or the other?
Exactly.
This other theme, denial of individual racism, a statement made when whites deny their racial bias. I'm not a racist. I have several Black friends. As a woman, I know what you go through as a racial minority, which I love. And I have been told that by several white women. We're all the same. Like, well, I tell you what, why don't we?
Well, not really.
Yeah. Why don't we both make a false police report talking about the other one being dangerous and see which one of us get arrested and not shot? No, we're not all the same. Or that I'm immune to racists because I have friends of color. Your racial oppression is no different than my gender oppression. And I have been told that as well. I can't be a racist because I'm like you. I mean, it's absurd.
Exactly. And speaking of that, actually, and I know this might go just a little off subject, but this is kind of a perfect example of this. I was watching a show on Netflix recently, and it was about a serial killer because, why not? And the only victim to actually survive was an African-American woman. And just by chance, I mean, she talked her way out of this house after being brutally handled for days. I'm not going to get into details, but she was able to get to a payphone, and she called the police. And this is back in 1992, I believe. And she tells them what happened, and their response, well, we don't go to that neighborhood. You're going to have to come to us.
Wow. And
to me, because of the neighborhood that she was living in being predominantly Black, the police were like, well, you're not white,
Mm-hmm.
so we're not going to really pay. They didn't pay attention until a white woman disappeared. So those are the things that, you know, even we like to think that we're evolved as a society, but when we look backwards, it really wasn't that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
When it was just rampant being the norm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, rampant racism just being the norm, and it wasn't reduced down to microaggressions.
Right.
So, I mean, we're making headway,
Mm-hmm.
but having to deal with, you know, the biases that are so deep rooted that you may not even know it's one of those things that, you know, you still have to keep an eye on the entire time. It's not just something you just pay attention to once in a seminar, but even as us, as Pride planners, that is something you have to keep in the forefront of your mind when you are planning these events, to ensure that something that you put up on the wall is not a microaggression to someone who's attending your event.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So just something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Microaggressions and depression, there is definitely a link. And what people have to understand, if this is something you're experiencing on a regular basis, daily, oftentimes when people say something to you that might be insulting, it might be a microaggression, in their mind, they're thinking, well, I don't know why you're offended by that. I just have a question. It doesn't seem to occur to them that that same question may have been asked of you a million times, over and over and over. But they think, well, this is the first time you're hearing it, you know? So why are you so upset? You know?
Exactly.
And it's there's a link between microaggressions and depression. There's a link between, you know, with African Americans and Black trauma. You know, you're dealing with something like this on a regular basis. And unfortunately, people just seem to be oblivious of how it can affect you. So the effects of microaggressions aren't subtle at all and can include symptoms such as depression and anxiety. Microaggressions can accumulate over a person's lifetime, which can lead to trauma and negatively affecting relationships with family and friends and even coworkers. So it's something to be taken seriously. One of the things we also have to take in consideration is gender-based microaggressions. So we have to be mindful of how we're communicating with women. We have to think about how we touch women, how we speak to women, and how much of how we react and how we treat women is based in our training and our experience in a patriarchal society.
Exactly. Yeah, too many times, you know, when we talk about this, you know, with gender, the old stereotypical things come to mind of, you know, talking down to, putting their hands on their shoulders while talking to them from behind, all those little things that, you know, again, people never thought twice about in the 80s, 90s, 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
It's something now that super excited that people are talking about, because that is a microaggression, because it's almost like reassuring that person that you're the boss.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to me because you're a woman. You know, that sort of attitude, and just expressed through this little tiny gesture that no one would really think about, but you know it's going on. It's been acknowledged now. This has to stop.
Right. Absolutely. Number 2, don't insist women prove their qualifications if you wouldn't ask the same of a man. Where I'm sure you remember, I don't know who this idiot was, but our First Lady, Joe Biden, has a doctorate degree. And he was saying that because she wasn't a physician, that she shouldn't use doctor with her name. And I'm thinking, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that about a man.
Shameful.
It was utterly ridiculous. Like and we do that.
She went through the same education, the same training to get a doctorate. I'm sorry, she's a doctor.
Right. It's ridiculous. So yeah, we want to keep in mind, if we, you know, don't ask women questions or make assumptions that we wouldn't have men. It's just, you know, really as simple as that. Don't assume women aren't as smart as men.
And even in my
Go ahead, Paul.
Exactly. I was saying, even in my professional life, with people that I work with, if I ask someone to do something who may be, a subordinate to my position at my work, I will never ask someone to do something that I have not done myself.
Mm-hmm.
Plain and simple.
Right.
I truly believe that if you're not willing to do it, how dare you ask someone else to do it?
Right. And
that's how you learn. That's how you experience.
And this is something that women go through very early on. If they're in the public school system, they don't get the attention in the classroom that boys get, whether they are acting, with boys acting out, when boys raise their hands, and girls raise their hands, boys there's a tendency to call them boys more than girls. And I really like what the second paragraph points out, that these microaggressions really try to silence women, whether they're conscious or not. That is the point of it, to silence women.
Exactly.
And then the assumption is that women aren't as intelligent as men. And we see that in different fields. Female lawyers have to prove themselves, and female doctors have to prove themselves in a way that...
Yeah, any woman in the STEM area.
Absolutely.
Any woman in STEM.
That's true. It's funny that the supermodel Cindy Crawford, as her modeling career was taken off, she graduated high school as valedictorian. She was accepted in college, and I think it was an engineering course. But looking the way she looked, she walked in, at her college class for engineering or math, and the teacher says, "I think you're in the wrong class," before asking her anything, just based purely off of what she looked like. And
off the look.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, women must go through this so many times. So we, as the male persuasion, we have to do better than that.
Yes.
And we certainly shouldn't we shouldn't tell anyone. We certainly shouldn't tell women how to behave. Women are not children. Even though we're in a patriarchal society, it is not the man's role to, control or discipline the woman.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Number 5, don't shoehorn women into traditional roles. Assume that because she's a woman, she's going to be nurturing, or she's going to, take care of you, or, provide the meals at work. Oh, well, Sharon would do it. She's going to cook because, she's a woman. Or, I've seen cop shows where there's a baby or a small child, left alone, and they immediately turn the child over to the female police officer. Like, that woman may not know anything about children. Why? And then there could be a guy there who has 6 children of his own. Why is the assumption that she's going to be the nurturer? And, this isn't just straight men, straight or heterosexual cisgender men who do this. Gay and bisexual men certainly have internalized misogyny, toxic masculinity,
absolutely,
gender role norms, which can result in a problem in their romantic relationships as well. So yeah, we have to watch it as well.
Absolutely. I mean, let's be honest. All of these, the internalized misogyny and toxic masculinity within the gay community is beyond rampant.
Yeah.
With some, and it's sad, but it's something that we do absolutely have to acknowledge and work on for us to get any better.
Right. And that's kind of the point of this series. This is part of the Rainbow Racism series that we're doing today. And the whole point is that we educate ourselves about the racism, the biases that we encounter within queer spaces. Because if we don't start with us, we have no hope of, providing education to the larger community.
Exactly. And, speaking to that, when I was running Austin Pride, that was one of my main focuses when we booked entertainment for our festival or our parade or what have you. Anyone that we had booked to come in and perform, we really looked to cover all gender expressions, all nationalities, all ethnicities. We tried to get something for everyone. So everyone felt represented in some way on that main main stage, because representation and visibility matter.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And here we don't assume gender is binary, which we shouldn't do. We absolutely assume gender is binary,
Exactly.
but we should not do that. And when it comes to individuals who identify as genderqueer or non-binary, we have to be careful and not to misgender them. Now, if we do and we're corrected, accept the correction, accept the education, be mindful of it and move on. But don't make it seem like, well, they're the
and please apologize.
Oh, definitely apologize. And don't make it seem like they're
Yes,
the
please.
ones with the problem. You know, is people want, you know, if you are a cisgender man, particularly a cisgender heterosexual man, and someone constantly refers to you as a woman, you're probably going to take some offense to that. Then if that's the case, certainly be mindful of not misgendering other people, genderqueer people or non-binary people, especially when they've already told you multiple times how they wish to be identified.
Exactly. And just take them at their word that that is exactly how they feel.
Mm-hmm.
No need to question it. Are you sure?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Did I not say I'm sure?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So in the video, we talked about the Harvard Implicit Association test. I have taken this test, and it really wasn't, I guess the only thing that was surprising to me, because I did it in grad school, and you know, the professor said that we were welcome to discuss our results, but no one had to in case you were embarrassed about your results. And I have a bias towards Black people. And I said, I was surprised about that. And the professor said, well, why? I said, well, I'm married to a white man. Almost all of my friends are white, or at the very least, they're not Black. Most of the homophobia that I've experienced and the colorism that I've experienced have come from Black people. So I assume that I would probably, you know, have a bias towards white people, or at least people who are not Black. And so I actually took it again after school, after I graduated. And again, I have a bias towards Black people. I think it's interesting to have that information, because now you have a better understanding of some of the challenges you face and some of the biases that you hold on to. Have you ever taken this test, Paul?
I haven't, but I'm actually curious to do it now. And, you know, speaking to what you were just talking about, is that just goes to show you that you really do not know what bias someone may hold. Because to look at you, you would never in a million years expect that underlying bias exists in you. But it also goes towards, you know, it's not just the person. You can't really judge by looking at them. It's how they grew up. It's environmental factors, how their parents reacted, how their parents behaved, how their parents responded to things, how their teachers responded to things. All of those things go into kind of solidifying those underlying biases that you may or may not know exist, just from you growing up and what happened around you and to you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You know, in my situation, even though I went to a predominantly white school up into the 6th grade, I was at a predominantly Black school. And when it came to Black History Month, we didn't just say, oh, thank you, Martin Luther King. Thank you, Harriet Tubman. Thank you, you know, Rosa Parks. I mean, we went in on it. And I think going to a school where there are predominantly Black students, predominantly Black teachers, we were really taught to embrace our heritage. And so by the time I'm 12 and I get bussed out in the Valley, every time there was a challenge to my pride as a Black person, it's like, no, we're not having that. We're not having that. Even at 12 and 13, I was able to take a stance. I'm like, no, you're not going to, you know, tell me that what I am and what I'm not, especially when it's an experience that you yourself don't have.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So I mentioned before this book, Caste. by Isabel Wilkerson, and how it changed my life, because she really helps us to think about the biases in other terms other than race. Because I think in United, at least in the United States, we really get stuck on race. And it's like we can't see anything else when it comes to biases and injustice. We want to deny that race had anything to do with it. And her book really helps us to appreciate that we're part of a caste system. She points out that the framers of Nazism actually studied Jim Crow laws in the United States. The framers of apartheid in South Africa studied, Jim Crow laws in the United States. So, and then when we think about caste, most of the time we automatically go to India, and Indian people would consider themselves the same race. So then how does this caste system work if it's more than about look? Is such an important read for us to really get our mind out of what we have traditionally thought of bias, how limited that has been, and that is much broader than what we've been exposed to in our society.
Right. And I haven't read this book yet. It's on my to-do list, but I'm excited to read this book.
Absolutely. Paul, do you want to read the quote there? Can you see that?
Yeah. A caste system is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract, but are ascribed life and death meaning in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste who forebears designed it. The caste system uses rigid, often arbitrary boundaries to keep ranked groupings apart, distinct from one another and in their assigned places.
So that really helps us to see that it's not limited to race, that anything can be used to divide one another. I really appreciate the point. It's an artificial construction. So if it wasn't race, it would be something else. Like in India, it's not so much focused on race. Even in Nazi Germany, once they got to the point where they could not find the Jews, if they gotten rid of Jews or the Jews have gone underground, they started looking at people who didn't look quite white to them. So the whole point being, you're going to find something, and that racism is just a tool used for division. That's not the sole issue in itself.
Right, exactly.
So a caste system endures because it's often justified as divine will, originating from sacred texts or the presumed laws of nature reinforced throughout the cultures and passed down through the generations. In America, the Bible was used to justify slavery. So a person will use whatever tool they feel would be beneficial at their exposure to put down and to marginalize, to elevate themselves and have
hold power over.
Yeah, exactly. And so again, it shows that it can take many forms. It could be religion. It could be within India, they're choosing different ways to for that social hierarchy that's not really so much focused on race, but whatever works. You want to read that, Paul?
Many people may say, I had nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was there when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but but here we are. The current occupants stressed cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We didn't erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. Further, deterioration configuration is, in fact, on our hands.
I found this to be powerful. I mean, that you can't give the excuse
Agreed.
that we didn't cause the issues that lead or contribute to systemic racism. So therefore, how are we responsible? Well, we're all in this together. We all own this home, right? And so any adjustments, anything that needs to be fixed, that falls on the responsibility of its citizens.
Exactly. You can't just ignore it now that you know about it.
Right.
You have to do something.
Mm-hmm. I really like, there was an example of the whole Robert E. Lee statue somewhere in the South, I'm not sure. But a direct descendant of it took full responsibility. He said, no, this was like a great-great-great-grandfather or something of his. But he felt like, no, this was an example of division. We don't want to celebrate someone who, contributed to this country being divided against itself. So even this, when I hear people say, well, it's just tradition. No, it didn't work. It didn't work. And so we shouldn't keep using it. And to hear a direct descendant say, I agree, this image of my distant relative should be taken down. I thought that was powerful. He was taking responsibility for what his ancestors contributed to the division in this country.
Exactly. And he didn't run and hide from it.
Right.
He confronted it.
Exactly. This is Martin Luther King's pilgrimage to India. What was interesting there is that, he and his wife were received almost like royalty, and keep in mind, this is in the 60s. This is a time when Black people in this country were not even considered full-class citizens. And yet over in India, they have this great welcome and appreciation for this man who was trying to bring peace. He was introduced at a speaking engagement in India and said, well, he's like us. He is like amongst the untouchables in his country. And at first, Martin Luther King took offense to that. But then he thought about it. He's like, well, no, you're right. I see what you're saying. And I think that was one of the reasons why they had this connection with Martin Luther King in India at that time, amongst those who were considered on the lower part of the spectrum, or the untouchables, that this is someone who shows that you could be seen that way and yet have a great deal of intelligence and attributes to offer our society.
And I almost wish there was an alternate photo of Dr. King and his wife either leaving or arriving back in the United States, so that we could see the side-by-side dichotomy of what they went through. Because knowing that time frame, I'm sure they were given stares, looked at, God knows what, spit at as they were in the airport in the States. And then to be received that way in India is just such a twist on the mind of how two places can exist in time, but be completely years apart culturally.
Absolutely. So now we have some quotes from some writers, from celebrities that I think are really important and very impactful. This is from Sonia Renee Taylor. The author of The Body is Not an Apology, The Power of Radical Self-Love. She says, systems do not maintain themselves. Even our lack of intervention is an act of maintenance. Every structure in every society is upheld by the active and passive assistance of other human beings. And this is impactful because you hear people, I'm not political, I'm not a social activist. And the point is, you are involved in this, whether you are actively involved or not. You are a participant in what's going on in our society.
Exactly.
This is Angela Davis, professor and American political activist. I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things that I cannot accept. I found this to be incredibly powerful and one that I really want to adopt. I can't just say I'm going to adopt this because I know that's a process, but I really want to adopt that as well. The things that I cannot accept, I want to participate in actively changing it. What do those words mean to you, Paul?
I love this quote.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely love this quote. You know, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. It literally speaks to just that inner fire within me that just says, get in. You know,
Absolutely.
It's like when I first got involved with Pride, it was one of those things that if you don't like what's going on, get involved.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, pick up a sign, march in a parade, attend a planning meeting, anything, no matter how big or small, everything helps.
Absolutely.
And this is what this tells me. Seeing injustice, don't sit quietly.
Mm-hmm. This is Malcolm Gladwell, who's an author. He said, our attitudes towards things like race or gender operate on two levels. First of all, we have our conscious attitudes. That is what we choose to believe. There are our stated values, which we use to direct our behavior deliberately. But the implicit association test measures something else. It measures our second level of attitude, our racial attitude on an unconscious level. The immediate automatic associations that tumble out before we even had time to think. We don't deliberately choose our unconscious attitudes, and we may not even be aware of them. The giant computer that is our unconscious silently crunches all the data. It crunches all the data it can from the experience we've had and people we've met, the lessons we've learned, the books we've read, the movies we've seen, and so on. It forms an opinion. It's so true. It's so true that you know, this is what we were talking about, being in a society and dealing with everything that contributes to the society and think you're not affected by that.
Exactly. You know, whether you think you are or not, it is affecting you in some way. That's why when we were talking about a repeated microaggression over time, absolutely will contribute to depression and more. You know, and it can create that self-hatred. You know, it plants that seed, you know, microaggression after microaggression. So it does, things do matter. Words matter, and what you to someone matters.
Absolutely. This is our First Lady and former First Lady and former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Paul, you want to read that?
I think implicit problem for everyone, not just police. I think, unfortunately, too many of us in America jump to conclusions about each other. And no true words were ever spoken.
Exactly.
You know?
I like the way she brings up police because, as you know, that's a big issue right now in this country.
Right, you know. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, absolutely, you know, and back in the 90s, we were talking about racial profiling, you know, how police were racial profiling. And now we're actually talking about the root cause of that profiling, which is those implicit biases that those officers have that can lead to decisions that will affect real world people.
Exactly. And when we deny...
but it's not just the police. It's the judge, it's the jury, it's the social workers, it's the prison guards, it's the CEOs, it's everyone. I mean, no one is immune to this.
Absolutely. I watched an interview with Judge Judy, I think on The View, and she brought up how Mayor Giuliani, the New York mayor at the time, turned Trump's personal attorney, but he's often credited with keeping the country safe, cleaning up crime in New York, those kind of things. So one of the Black panelists said, yeah, but this is also the person who introduced stop and frisk, which contributed to mass incarceration of Black and brown people in New York. Her response to that as a judge, yeah, but I felt safer.
And there again, that's that implicit bias creeping up to the surface. You know, even a judge.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. This is psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. He said, human beings are poor examiners, subject to superstition, bias, prejudice, and a profound tendency to see what they want to see rather than what is really there. And I really feel this when I encounter someone who says we're all the same. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I'm colorblind. I'm thinking you're blind to seeing what's there and you're seeing what you want to see.
Exactly. And let me just say to that, that was something I would say when I was, 10 years old, 11 years old, that I didn't see color because I had not learned the vocabulary or the processes in my brain to actually vocalize how I truly felt. So when a grown person says that to me, the only thing I can think is their ignorance is showing.
Yeah.
I'm not stupid. I'm calling them ignorant.
Oh, yeah, because there's a difference.
There is a difference.
In many cases, it's willful ignorance, and that's the sad part.
And that's a whole nother discussion.
That's true. So here's a quote from a very influential woman, Disney's Princess Jasmine. She said, sometimes we only see how people are different from us, but if you look hard enough, you can see how much we're alike. And I know for some people, they don't want to focus on the differences. They want to focus on the similarities. And I say that's fine, but don't ignore the differences and don't reject
exactly,
because different is good. There's nothing wrong with being different, but don't allow that to be a tool to divide us, because we are much more alike than we are different.
Exactly. And it almost bears, vocalizing that even though we are actively working towards everyone recognizing the similarities we have with one another to bring peace and prosperity to everyone, the differences shouldn't be divisive. They should be celebrated. And that is how we have a colorful and vibrant world to live in, is realize we are all human, but celebrate the differences because that is what makes life interesting.
Right. I agree. I go back to what my grandfather said. I mean, what if all the flowers were exactly the same color, exactly the same scent? We wouldn't appreciate it as much. So, I mean, I think if we can appreciate the differences in flowers, we can appreciate the diversity in human beings,
Exactly.
Well, don't you look? Go ahead and read that quote, Paul.
I love this answer. I've learned that people will forget what you said, will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel.
Isn't that the truth?
Love her. It's so powerful words.
Absolutely. It's kind of scary right now because we seem to be losing our wise people, the people who really tried to bring the country and the world together through their words, through their activism, through their education. We've lost so many of them in recent years, and I don't know if our society has the same luminaries now that we, with the people we just lost.
Oh no, exactly. She was a giant among giants.
Absolutely. Very powerful. Well, Paul, I usually reserve this part for questions, but we're recording this. But
since it's just us.
I want to thank you for doing this with me. I mean, I'm giving this workshop alone lots of times, but it's nice to have a different perspective, a different voice. When we're talking about a subject that for so many people, it's difficult and even triggering. So thank you for doing this. And with that, I want to make sure, well, I'm going to give you the last word, but let me say this. Again, this is part of InterPride's Rainbow Racism series. Something I'm very proud of to, kind of take the lead on this, where we are endeavoring to educate our community about the racism and the biases that we encounter in queer spaces, queer organizations, queer communities. We've had conversations about white fragility, women of color and the racism that they face. We recently had the indigenous people of Australia. We have Sydney World Pride coming up. And so we wanted to hear from the indigenous people of Australia about the racism and biases that they encounter within queer spaces. And it was just so informative. And we have another one coming up at the end of March, where we will talk about interracial relationships and the challenges and the joys that we face that being in interracial relationships. My husband James is going to lead the discussion with different perspectives, a perspective coming from a white person in that relationship, a Latino person in the interracial relationship, a Black person in the interracial relationship. So I feel like it's going to be very informative and help to expose us to some of the challenges that many of our community faces. So I want people to, stay abreast of these workshops. We're cranking them out. We're trying to get make this a regular thing to constantly have this information out there. Once we give it, it's going to be available on Facebook. This one will probably, our workshop today will probably be available at the end of April. But with that said, I just wanted everyone to know, go to InterPride.org or InterPride's Facebook page to get more information. And thank you for joining us. And with that, Paul, you get the last word.
I just want to say thank you, Richard, for asking me. I'm absolutely delighted anytime to help out, as you know. And the last thing I would leave with us, again, my two favorite L words: listen and learn. Listen to those around you with different experiences, points of views, and ethnic backgrounds and perspectives. Those people will enrich your life from having a singular point of view, a tunnel vision, to widescreen.
Mm-hmm.
Learn from what they say and learn from their experiences and how to better improve the world through your own actions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome.
Take care.
Bye, all.
Bye.